Welcome to the second in our series of workshops on developing the next generation of research leaders for sustainable development. WUN is offering the series in collaboration with UNESCO and with the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. The workshops are intended to help enlarge the networking opportunities for researchers in the early stages of their careers. An important part of WUN's mission is to nurture research talent. And historically, we've done that through a mobility program aimed at early career researchers. That program, along with many of the other means by which researchers typically establish their collaborative networks, has of course been upended by COVID-19. Now, this series of workshops is a response to that. The workshops are intended to help researchers find peers and potential collaborators who have related interests, stopgap until life gets back to normal. If they're a success, we'll have created a vehicle for enlarging opportunity generally, and especially for researchers whose freedom to collaborate internationally has in the past been limited by financial or other restrictions on travel. The emphasis on the SDGs, and each workshop will explore one and the research challenges that attend it, stems from WUN's adoption of sustainable development as the principal research focus of its strategic plan. Later in this session, I'll say more about the particulars of our research agenda and the ways in which you can become involved in it. But first we'll hear from two distinguished speakers who will characterize some of the rich challenges and opportunities presented by Goal 4, quality education. We hope there will be a little time for questions after the remarks of our speakers. And if you'd like to ask a question as you listen to the presentations, please use the Q&A function, and we'll take the questions at the end of the presentations if there's time. Our first speaker is Stefania Giannini, Assistant Director General for Education at UNESCO. In that role, Dr. Giannini is the top UN official dealing with education and leads the coordination of the Education 2030 agenda. She came to her position after a distinguished career as an academic and as a public servant, including service as Professor of Linguistics, as a university rector, and later in the Italian government as Minister of Education, Universities and Research. We're delighted to have her with us today, especially in the context of our partnership with a section in higher education within her Division for Education 2030. Dr. Giannini.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's great. So good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, wherever you are. And thank you very much to the World Universities Network for this invitation. And I realize this session focuses on SDG 4 as part, as you said, Peter, of a series of webinars organized for early career researchers on all the SDGs, the 2030 agenda as a whole. I warmly commend this initiative, and I will focus very much on the specific perspectives on SDG 4 in my presentation. But let me open first with a few words about the strategic role of higher education in achieving the SDGs as an integrated, interconnected agenda for a better society. UNESCO, as you know, advocates for gearing university curricula around the SDGs. And we believe that education stands at the center of the entire 2030 agenda because it provides the knowledge and skills that empower people to better their lives and that of their societies, especially now, especially in these unprecedented times we're living within. Maybe you remember last year, in the middle of the crisis, the UN Secretary General has called for a decade of action because the world is not on track to achieve the 17 SDGs with the dramatic consequences for the future. These are exacerbated by the pandemic. And the UN Secretary General talked to the leaders of the world about the risk, the concrete risk we have of a generational catastrophe. Well, this acceleration and transformation they demand calls for tighter connections between research and policies, interdisciplinary approaches, and scale-up knowledge sharing. This is what universities are about from the very beginning of the history of these important institutions. And this is why UNESCO is leading a global dialogue on open science to prompt free and open access to knowledge. UNESCO and Norway have established a global working group on higher education for the SDGs. This group is about describing the new knowledge required by the 2030 agenda and the role that university play in generating and sharing it, in terms of curriculum development, in terms of research, in terms of networking around the common mission of SDG 4 and as a cross-cutting infrastructure for development. More than ever, intellectual collaboration will be a driver for recovery and transitioning to a more sustainable development model. The pandemic, we know, has definitely amplified, exposed the fragility of our global crisis response system and amplified inequalities and the extent of our interdependence. From health to climate change to the digital divide, connectivity has been increasingly a critical issue last year and still being that. Even, I think, every global issue today requires global solutions, requires a more network and inclusive multilaterally, in order to develop a real political commitment and operational action plans. Underlying this principle, this is a culture of intellectual collaboration. And we have witnessed this in the medical and health sciences over the past year, for sure. This is not UNESCO competence, but I can tell you that we cooperated so strictly with WHO and other partners in order to see how the impact of the crisis of the pandemic definitely affected so heavily the education systems in the world, from the preschooling to university level. Multilateral cooperation in education and research will be definitely all the more essential to achieve SDG 4 in the wake of the current disruption. And we are now in a recovery phase, and we are starting really with a new commitment to relaunch the role of education as a pillar of the recovery phase in terms of investment and in terms of priority, political priority in all countries of the world. Let me recall the broad ambition of this goal before focusing a bit more on the action plan I would like to present and to share with you. The ambition of SDG 4, as you know, is about ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education for all and promoting lifelong learning opportunities. Even before this pandemic, close to 260 million children and youth were globally out of school, and large numbers were not mastering the basic curriculum after several years in school. This is just the surface of the issue. More research and scale-up action are required to make education transformative and accessible throughout life. The pandemic has definitely been somewhat of a kind of tsunami for education. We can say honestly that after and beyond health, education as a public sector has been absolutely the more affected by the pandemic, still has been. Never before in history have students, teachers, faculty, educators experienced such disruption. Today, where we are talking in this meeting, some 800 million students remain affected by partial or full school and university closures. It's about 30 countries, more or less, still deciding to shut down their education systems. The crisis has uprooted a number of common beliefs, whether on the resistance of education sector to innovation or predictions that technology can replace teachers. So to mention some of the commonplace and the topics being discussed over the last 10, 12 months. The challenge we face now is to prevent a wider crisis in education and learning, and to ensure that inequalities exposed and exacerbated, amplified by COVID-19 don't permanently disadvantage a whole generation. From recovery to resilience to reimagining education, I think these are the 3 steps we are definitely running now. New thinking and more innovative solutions are required to avoid such, as I said before, quoting from Antonio Guterres, a generational catastrophe. Let me brush a few dimensions for collaborative research and cooperation in education. We have entered new territory over the past year and have only partial knowledge of the multiple impacts on education. Countries has been in a learn by doing mode, and international organizations like UNESCO, supporting them in doing. First, the data dimension. They were already insufficient before the crisis. Qualitative data, including from new resources, as well as quantitative research, is key now to design effective policy responses. We lack knowledge, for example, on the effectiveness of remote learning solutions, on the extent and nature of learning losses. This is something we have started to collect data and focus on, but still at the beginning of the process. On the impact of closures on the mental health of learners and educators. And then precise data is required on children and youth at risk of never returning to school, what we define, technically speaking, the dropout, on the design of remedial programs and the effectiveness they can have. Second point, the technology and learning dimension. Innovations around technology-enabled learning that were introduced so quickly at the onset of the crisis merit much more research and comparative analysis. It can be argued that technology is now a must-have, this is for sure. It can be argued that the right to education must include, in a new kind of framework, connectivity in terms of education, learning, and teaching being accessible for all. But how can countries facilitate inclusive access to platforms and digital learning resources, reform teacher training models, expand connectivity? These are questions which definitely form part for shaping the new educational landscape in the coming months, starting this year. The third dimension I wish to touch upon is the content dimension. Reorienting the education systems around inclusion, relevance, and sustainability call for new curricula and new pedagogical approaches. It's almost obvious, but it's really something which must be, especially now, with some lessons learned in this disruptive context we are living, we had to focus very much on. Education systems globally are far from being inclusive, we know. We have data about that. They don't give enough space to socio-emotional skills, for instance, that play definitely an influential, decisive role in learning, as research from neurosciences demonstrate clearly. Digital and AI literacy are still at the very beginning. nor are education systems sufficiently geared to promoting the skills and behaviors that can foster sustainable development and global citizenship. There are two key areas in which UNESCO collaborates with university researchers. They are the two sides of the same coin that definitely represent the target 4.7 in the SDG 4 agenda. And finally, I bring in the ethical dimension, which is another critical one we have to consider and focus more. In particular, with regards to the use of artificial intelligence in education and data privacy issues. UNESCO is developing the first global instrument on the ethics of AI, canvassing the world's leading scholars and try to see which are, the real tools we have to put in practice and call governments to respect as a set of rules and principles to share based on a value-based approach. Researchers can make a real difference in this landscape I try to summarize. Beyond research and teaching, academics also act as society's conscience, as society's drivers, so to say, intellectually speaking especially. The next generation of researchers can help to bring a humanistic, values-based approach to education and development issues. And they can play a critical role in terms of advocacy, in terms of role models, in terms of innovators and proposing their own agenda. They can bring ideas, understanding, and intellectual leadership to policy debates. Many international organizations, bilateral donors, NGOs are currently investing in research departments. UNESCO itself is strengthening its role as a laboratory of ideas, conducting research on many aspects of SDG 4. We publish an annual flagship global monitoring report on education based on an extensive research exercise, which combines definitely both the quantitative and qualitative dimension. Many of our research projects hire external researchers on temporary assignments, and academics are often invited to speak at UNESCO meetings, seminars, conferences, and also very much part of our teams in terms of consultants, advisors, and sometimes really, they belong to the same community. The third World Higher Education Conference, to be held this October in Barcelona, will be an incredibly powerful platform for fully engaging academics, researchers, and young researchers, especially in progress towards the SDGs. In summary, I see at least 3 significant roles for the next generation of researchers around the 2030 agenda, and in particular focusing on SDG 4. Fostering mutually beneficial research partnership, knowing that historically research partnerships have often been unbalanced. Research capacity must be strengthened across the world, especially so that researchers in low resource contexts are empowered to design, conduct, and communicate research and contribute to global debates. The next generation of researchers, I'm sure, has the responsibility to co-design research projects and co-create knowledge and understanding, including collaborative research methodologies. Investing in intellectual cooperation, for example, by getting involved in professional associations and networks, umbrella bodies such World Council of Comparative Education Societies have an important role to play in our vision in this international cooperation. You may also find ways to collaborate with research centers in the UNESCO UniTwin program, CHAIRS program, which has more now than 800 chairs and cooperation programs in over 100 countries, member states of UNESCO in the world. And finally, I kindly ask you to consider, to reflect and to take into account the contribution that you can make as researchers to helping the international community to shape the future. This is about, taking some opportunities they're running now in the coming months in order to bring your ideas, your vision, maybe a kind of totally different perspective from that we have, and contribute to design what we call at UNESCO the futures, with S of plural, mark of education. We are leading as UNESCO an exciting initiative which we call exactly like this, the futures of education, that you can be involved with online. As a future researcher, leaders, you can really help us to shape the next international development agenda. And I think it's about putting the right questions on the table, and then we'll find together, I'm sure, the right answers, and being able to commit ourselves to fulfill the universal right to education in this new landscape you are living within. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Giannini, for a very comprehensive characterization of the challenges and, of course, the opportunities that face us moving ahead. Our second speaker is Dawn Freshwater, Chair of the WUN's Partnership Board and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Auckland. Before assuming her position in Auckland last year, Professor Freshwater served as Senior Deputy Vice-Chancellor and then Vice-Chancellor of the University of Western Australia. She's widely recognized internationally, both for her major research contributions to mental health and for her work in fostering international collaboration among universities and promoting their engagement with their communities. Dawn.
Kia ora and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you, Peter. Peter, first of all, can I just congratulate the World University Network on the innovative response through such seminars and fora as these in terms of really supporting our early career researchers. You made a comment in your opening around the back to normal. And there is a question at the moment, I think, that's really circulating for all of us, which is, when is the future coming? Well, the future is here. And this is it. And somehow we have to think about this being, of course, a version of that normal for all of us, including our early career researchers. And Stefania, I was really intrigued with your presentation, and I really enjoyed your little journey through the methodological domains, and particularly when you talked about co-design and collaboration. And that's something that I'll focus on in my short summary here this morning. So just to say again, thank you for the opportunity to take part, and a very big welcome today to that next generation of research leaders for sustainable development. Those of you joining us have a huge responsibility, as we all do, of course, to really take these agendas forward. You've already heard from Peter and Stefania that we're coming together at this unprecedented time. And we understand that the pandemic, which is one of multiple contagions, let me say that, one of multiple contagions. There are many other contagions we're dealing with in higher education. Freedom of speech is one of them. When we think about what's happening in terms of Black Lives Matter, when we think about what's happening more broadly in terms of climate change, multiple contagions. But at this time, of course, the pandemic is really having enormous impact on researchers and early career researchers in particular. We're emphasising the positive aspects of that and the ways in which institutions and you yourselves can work with what we already know and build on that to innovate and to address those needs for future generations differently. Your natural collaborators, of course, we've already heard that from our previous speaker, is part of your DNA. And yet the traditional ways in which you've collaborated have largely been extinguished by the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's difficult to look back on last year, I think, and reflect on how we were suddenly confined to our homes and to think about how this is going to inform our future, but it certainly is. I myself, as you heard from Peter, arrived in Auckland about a year ago, just before the lockdown, and was straight into lockdown and having to manage a new university in a new country, a very large research-intensive university from within a room in a very different space than I was used to. And our lockdowns here have been very short compared with many parts of the world, but they have nevertheless we've experienced the loss of the research conferences, the workshops and the seminars, and those in-person collaborations that we all value so highly. This seminar is one of those adaptations, and there are many, and you're all working on them each day. I'm particularly concerned that our early career researchers have been affected by the pandemic and by the lockdowns more than I think some of our more experienced researchers. And I say that because established relationships across the globe can be sustained better, I think, online and via video conferencing, but nurturing those fledgling relationships online is difficult. Governments are aware of this. And I'll just mention that before I come to talk about the SDGs. In New Zealand, in late January, our Associate Minister of Research, Science and Innovation announced an additional $10 million to support the nation's top early career researchers to develop their research skills. When that announcement was made, I think the Associate Minister really recognised the impact of the pandemic on the science system and the science workforce due to those travel restrictions and other restrictions, of course. You will know, and I know, that after completing and during a PhD, for example, many researchers travel, and in 2020 they couldn't. The successful researchers, including those in the humanities and social science and those with Māori knowledge skills, will receive a fellowship to help grow and develop their skills at home here in New Zealand. Many countries are doing this. Many governments recognise the impact on science at this point. And of course, if you think about it, we've been able to, in an unprecedented time, work together across nations to create vaccines in less than 1 year. And it's higher education and research that has really been the cornerstone of that activity. It's a phenomenal outcome and one in which we should all be proud of. And it signals not only to government, but to many stakeholders, just how important we are at times like this. The challenges that we're here to discuss today, and in particular, the major research opportunities associated with those challenges, relate to Sustainable Development Goal 4, quality education. And we've heard already from our previous speaker around the importance of this and our commitment to all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. At the University of Auckland, it's SDG 4 that we really have a close association with. The university is the United Nations Academic Impact Hub for SDG 4, leading the hub for 1,300 institutions across 130 countries. And you've already heard that this sets goals for inclusive and equitable quality education, promoting lifelong opportunities for all. We're all joined here today by our commitment to these goals and to the research that can advance them. And now and in the future, COVID will be a backdrop to that research, given its impact on inclusivity and equity, and not just for our stakeholders, for our students, for our communities, but for all of you, our early career researchers, it will certainly have an impact on inclusivity and equity across this group. The United Nations predicts that due to school closures, some 90% of students have been kept out of schools for some part of this year. Now, we haven't experienced this extensively in New Zealand, but I think about my relatives, for example, in the UK and in Australia, and my grandchildren who've been kept out of school this week. It certainly is going to be a challenging problem for us all to think about in terms of research going forward. The UN also predicts that 65% of primary schools around the world, only 65%, let me say that, have access to basic hand washing facilities. We all know that this is critical for protection and prevention of COVID. The inequalities in education that existed prior to this pandemic have worsened, and at least 500 million students do not have digital access to learning and missing out on the changes and the challenges happening in the online space even now. I think about this from my own experience, having been as the Vice-Chancellor in the University of Auckland only a year, when for our Maori and Pacifica students, but also for our other students who had no access to broadband and attempting to study online in very difficult and cramped circumstances, one of our immediate challenges actually was to try and support our students by sending devices out, couriering devices out to their homes and helping to set some of our own staff up with broadband access. And this is in New Zealand. And when we think about those countries where 500 million students do not have digital access, we as researchers and early career researchers need to think about this in the context of our future research and your future research questions. So let me just share a few thoughts in that regard. We know that the arrival of new technologies has the potential to widen access and participation, improving the consistency of education provision globally. But we also know that the growth in technology and other forms of online education does not automatically lead to a reduction in inequalities. Poor quality learning experiences and low recognition of online qualifications can result in inequalities persisting. Gains in personalization may be offset by a loss of relational aspects of learning, opportunities for dialogue, and the importance of that broader experiential learning, which we know as researchers are critical to really cementing that learning. COVID, we know, has accelerated the adoption of new technology. We're experiencing it right now here in this seminar, but it's also highlighted some of the shortcomings of online education, highlighting and in fact heightening our awareness of the inequities. There are concerns that the growth in online and blended modes of higher education threaten the concept of holistic learning, which includes those elements of culture, sport, political and vocational development, all of those things that really add to the whole experience of learning on campus. And of course, whilst flexibility has brought greater convenience and mobility, it can also result in an incoherent and fragmented learning experience, made difficult for those who are struggling to access cultural capital, such as I've just described. We will need to think about this as a World Universities Network, and I'm particularly keen for the network to think about this as the current chair. Our researchers need to consider which new models are best placed to address global inequities in higher education and widen access to research-informed learning at an affordable cost. We cannot forget the financial impact of the pandemic for all of us and the impact that that's going to have both in terms of access to higher education, but also the research into higher education of the future and the models of delivery. Secondly, how can the online models that we're talking about offer rich, high quality learning experiences, avoiding the recolonization of the academic space in developing regions? And I say that having worked most recently in Australia and now in New Zealand, this issue of recolonization of the academic space in developing regions is a critical one for us to consider as social scientists, and bringing that multidisciplinary approach to bear on our research agendas. This is a particular question as we face the challenge of inclusive and equitable education for all, and those global challenges that we remain fully committed to thinking about from an interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research perspective as part of the World University Network. We'll think about this as part of our work in the Partnership Board, but from the point of view of the early career researchers, we will need to consider, and you will need to consider, structural barriers to interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. These remain. Universities will need to explore mechanisms and incentives that will encourage interdisciplinary teams of skilled researchers to address big questions. It's also important to recognise that the discovery of new knowledge, Stefania talked about us as knowledge institutions, so the discovery of new knowledge and the understanding of that new knowledge relies on deep training in the methodologies and epistemologies of disciplines. So this is both and. It's important to think about the methodologies and the epistemologies of our discipline base, but at the same time, look at the structural barriers to the interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research we need to engage in. Both of those things have to coexist. Universities really need to work together to understand how to attract and retain researchers who can work across both of those domains. Harnessing interdisciplinary research to address grand societal challenges does not abandon basic discovery-led research. And in fact, addressing many of the SDGs first requires the discovery of new knowledge and cutting-edge conceptual innovations in those basic disciplinary knowledges. So this is about really thinking how we build the approach to delivering online learning through a research and cutting-edge knowledge that is developed from our basic discovery-led science, established through that epistemology in the discipline, and then really translated through interdisciplinary knowledge. You're all familiar with this, but I reiterate this because the challenge here is to promote collaboration, as we do in our network, interdisciplinary and strategic-driven research, whilst recognizing the role of individual researchers and their particular research agendas within their fields. It's particularly important then for you as early career researchers to have a strong disciplinary base from which to build on. Without that, you're disadvantaged. But also for us and university leaders like myself as the Vice-Chancellor at the University of Auckland, and through the network, the World University Network, to ensure that early career researchers have the opportunities to build disciplinary knowledge and then help them to translate across international networks, providing opportunities to collaborate across disciplines. So I challenge you, which type of mechanisms or incentives best enable interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research? And do the institutions that we belong to currently have the skills and resources to achieve genuine interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work that will support us in our efforts to address the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn, for so persuasively laying out the case for international and transdisciplinary collaboration, and also the case for needing to do business differently, in some ways very differently, as we move forward. We have We have time for a couple of questions. Aoife, will you be handling these?
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. As Peter said, we have time for a couple of questions. I'll present them both together, and following their response, we'll move directly back to Peter for the next presentation. The first question is, the pandemic will be remembered for its global disruption to education and the revelation of digital inequalities. What research opportunities exist as we move out of the pandemic to address inequalities within education, especially as delivery is likely to include more e-learning and technology? And the second question, how do we establish trust and legitimacy of research and academia generally at a time of accelerating populism, misinformation, and in the face of global crises?
So Aoife, I'm happy to start if I can with the second question. This is a much bigger question than just related to the pandemic. It actually goes to my first point about multiple contagions and free speech, but also it goes to one of the other contagions, which is the concerns that we all have around the relationship between fact and evidence and opinion and fake news. And of course, we've seen this been really crystallized through the pandemic, particularly when we think about the conspiracy theories and misinformation. We have, as higher education institutions, never more in my time, and I've been in my career, many, many years, never more in my time, we have a duty and an obligation to continue to work tirelessly and ruthlessly to really work with sharing knowledge, information, and being really open and transparent about access to that information in order to really contest the current environment within which evidence and fact has been relegated. Now, I say that actually in the context of the pandemic, which has, I think, really rehabilitated the importance of science, the role of evidence and fact in society. And no one can argue really that majority, I say the majority of politicians and policymakers have really engaged with our global scientists and researchers to understand how best to address and respond to the pandemic. This is a moment we really have to use. So yes, it's true. The first question, it could be that the pandemic is remembered for all of the things that you'll be thinking about: online education, digital disruption, and inequalities. But we could actually really create a compelling narrative around it being remembered for that rehabilitation of science, the rehabilitation of the application of data in a humane way. Stefania commented on this, the human element of what we do. And I've been talking quite a lot recently about the importance of the university and what it does to elevate its to-be list as well as its to-do list, to really story the purpose of what we're about. Our whole sense of being is really critical right now if we're going to tell that story and to gain traction against the populist movement that's just been described in the question.
Thank you. I can simply compliment these already comprehensive answers or comments which Dawn provided about digital learning. Yes, for sure. From the beginning of this crisis, definitely continuity learning has been assured thanks to leverage technology. We know there is still a huge digital divide to be filled, to be addressed. And on the other side, I think we also have the opportunity to see technology complementing a more integrated approach to learning and teaching, and not simply being a device and using infrastructures for being in touch at distance, but really rethinking the model of learning and teaching. In school systems, we definitely already measure and evaluate the difference between primary preschooling using technology with a lot of challenges to be still addressed, not having teachers so well prepared to assist their own little children who are, of course, less autonomous and less, naturally already able to learn through technology. We saw secondary schools doing better and improving the quality of interaction in the classroom, in the virtual classroom. But still the challenge is about thinking of a new kind of function and role for teachers and training teachers differently from what we did so far in the past. So the role of universities is also about, we have not to forget that generating the new generations of teachers. And this is about changing very much about the approach of teachers training from the beginning and in service. So I see the future not about competition between machine learning, robots in the classroom and teachers. I see future, especially thanks to the lessons we are learning in this COVID-19 about investing very much more through research and new pedagogies and methodologies in a different kind of learning and teaching environment. The second question is a very much critical one. I think Dawn has already, put on the screen the critical topics, which are about, I summarize like this from my perspective, education for democracy and the real critical role that education can have about generating knowledge, disseminating awareness, and changing the mindset and behaviors. And this is what we call, technically speaking, I mentioned before, the 4.7. That means a humanistic approach to education today is about curriculum development, focusing on the importance of transmitting values and tolerance and a new kind of approach to diversity and embedding in education systems cultural diversity as a component, a structural component of teaching and learning. And this is a bit the added value that UNESCO can bring to the entire international community through the unique situation this institution has since the establishment in the aftermath of the Second War, to have in the same house, in the same building, science, education, and culture, which are definitely the three pillars of what we need today in order to build back, to build back better and to transform society through a transformative power of education, science, and culture.
Thank you to both our speakers for their very illuminating presentations and, of course, their willingness to answer questions. Thank you both. As background to the breakout workshops, I'd like very briefly to tell you about WUN's research agenda, what's distinctive about it, and the opportunities to engage with it, so that you can have that in mind as you get together for discussion. The key attribute that WUN can bring to the table is the diversity of its member universities. They're all major research universities that sit in very different geographical, cultural, and legal contexts that not only shape how they support research and deliver education, but also provide them with distinctive, varied perspectives on many important research problems. WUN adds value because by capitalizing on the varied geographies and cultures of its members, it can assemble and support diverse teams of collaborators to tackle major research problems in fields where comparative analysis matters. So we'd welcome your engagement in our programs. There are lots of opportunities. The network provides a wide conduit of interesting and sometimes surprising international research collaborations. Many of them address real-world problems and offer opportunities for researchers to deploy their expertise in new ways. So how can you become engaged? Let me very briefly share the screen here and I'll show you. WUN's principal mechanism for supporting research is the Research Development Fund. That's a small grants program to seed collaborative work that we hope leads to major continuing projects. The WUN website has pages covering current and previous projects. So let me summarize very briefly how it works. There's an annual competition. It opens in July, closes in October, and it's limited submission per lead university. We make awards in December. The RDF supports work under the large umbrella of sustainable development, currently with an emphasis on how our recovery from the pandemic can be harnessed as a driver for sustainable development. And the particular fields in which we offer awards are informed by recommendations from 4 global challenge steering groups that you can see identified here. You can also engage directly with these groups, which organize workshops in the larger collaborative projects within their domains. And let me just very briefly highlight the initiatives now underway with the Global Higher Education and Research Group, which would welcome your engagement. That group is currently working on an initiative under the UN Research Roadmap for COVID-19 recovery. And the group is particularly interested in such questions as, how can environments be built, shaped, and sustained in ways that allow all people to thrive? How can an exclusionary digital divide be prevented in an increasingly virtual world? How can recovery efforts from emergencies help eliminate pre-existing social inequities to strengthen the resilience of communities? These are some of the questions the group is engaged in now. And as I say, it welcomes your involvement in its activities. If you're interested, you can see the contact information at the bottom of the screen. Very briefly, information about how to connect more generally. You can sign up with WUN Hub, a platform for researchers to search and connect with colleagues on ongoing WUN projects. The hub contains a lot of information. Under our research tab on the website, you can find information about how to contact our global challenge groups generally. You can contact your local WUN coordinator. Every member university has one, and you can see information about how to get hold of your coordinator on our WUN research page. And finally, our Secretariat staff are also happy to answer questions that you might have. During the breakout sessions we're about to start, there's a room called WUN Support, where our staff can answer your questions. So thank you for joining us. Please go into your breakout sessions now and connect with us as you need to move things forward. Thank you.